afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Catherine Malone France. I'm the president and CEO of the Better Angels Society, and I am delighted to welcome you all to this preview and discussion of a phenomenal documentary, Drop Dead City, New York on the Brink in 1975. At the Better Angels Society, we are pleased to be partnering on this event with the New York Historical Society. This is an especially appropriate partnership since the New York Historical Society is the repository for the papers of Felix Rohatyn, who is, of course, a central figure in Drop Dead City. More generally, though, we appreciate the New York Historical Society's collaboration with us on this event, and we look forward to future events exploring the history of New York, which is, of course, important to this country and the entire world. Thanks to our partnership with the New York Historical Society, we have a great audience today that includes folks who are part of the Better Angels community and new friends who are affiliated with the Historical Society. If you don't know the Better Angels Society yet, we're the leading national nonprofit supporting excellence in American history documentaries in ways that advance education and civic engagement. From programs for junior high and high school students to supporting films by award-winning documentarians on public media, we're providing more resources and more recognition to the people who are telling the stories of our shared history through films that are rooted in archival research and compelling storytelling. In all of our work, we seek to create community around the films we support, and today's program is just one example of that. We hope you'll join us for others. For today's program, in just a few minutes, we will see an exclusive preview of Drop Dead City that's about 10 minutes long, and then we're looking forward to a panel discussion with the filmmakers, Michael Rohatyn and Peter Yost, and a few other special guests who I'll introduce after the clip. You can drop questions in the Q&A along the way, and I'll use some of those in our discussion. After our conversation, we'll hear from Michael Rohatyn about the fundraising goals for the film and from our friends at the Gotham Film and Media Institute on how you can support it. In 2021, the American Historical Association asked Americans where they learn about their history. Given 19 choices, the top answer from 69% of respondents was documentary films. These films are incredibly powerful tools for illuminating our history and bringing people together. No one uses that tool with more creativity and skill and vision than the person who's going to kick us off today. His work is a large part of why Americans answered the question the way that they did. It's my honor to introduce and turn things over to the one and only Ken Burns.
Oh, thank you, Catherine. What a nice introduction. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this wonderful program this evening. In just a few short years, this documentary prize has gone from being an idea to the most important prize in documentary. It's the richest. We give $200,000 to the winner. We give $50,000 to the runner-up and 4 awards of $25,000 to honorable mentions, I guess you'd say. I wish I could take credit. It's so wonderful to be a part of it, but it's a brainchild of the Better Angels Society, Catherine and her crowd, and the Library of Congress, but mostly the generosity of Jonathan and Jeannie Lavine, who are a philanthropic couple who've supported documentary filmmaking for an awfully long time, and my work specifically, and really wanted to turn it around and broaden it. And so just in a few short years, we've awarded some extraordinary films on Flannery O'Connor, a wonderful film about the beginnings of hostage negotiations called Hold Your Fire, about a Brooklyn robbery that goes wrong and is just a riveting film. We've done something on the MOVE, we've awarded something on the MOVE movement in Philadelphia. That tragic story. We've done a wonderful film on the Bella Abzug and her political career, and also dealt with Detroit's financial woes over the years. All of the films are really wonderful. I particularly love the film that we're going to be talking about this evening, Drop Dead City. It's just a magnificently wonderful film and deserves all of your support. It is an important film. I remember being in New York, watching what was happening. I even saved the copy of the infamous Daily News where it said Ford City dropped dead. And I remember all the little haiku underneath it. Abe Carey, Abe being Abraham Beam, Carey being the governor of New York. Abe Carey, Rip Stan, Stock Skid, Dow Down 12. It was sort of like a natural poetry right there. And I had been very much invested in watching what had been going on. No one has come close to capturing the TikTok of that than this remarkable film by Michael Rohatyn and Peter Yost. It's really a wonderful film. The partnership that created this prize wouldn't really exist if we didn't have the extraordinary imprimatur of the Library of Congress. Through its chief librarian, Dr. Carla Hayden, we go through a very rigorous proposal process, judging process, 4 or 5 layers, until finally she and I are presented with the top few films, and I always yield to her. She decides what it's going to be. And so we feel it's a wonderful process. We want it to go on, and this film is particularly worthy of our support. And I'm so proud to be even tangentially appropriate at what Michael and Peter have done is really nothing less than extraordinary. So let me be quiet and introduce the first clip, as Catherine said, about 10 minutes long, and then the evening will open up with some very, very special guests, in addition to the very special Michael and Peter who have made this film. So thanks all for attending. I think you'll be riveted, as I was, to this extraordinary film, and I hope you'll help get it out to a wide public. Thank you so much.
When I became controller in 1974, I made a pledge that I would conduct the first independent audits of New York City's finances. Well, as we started to roll up our sleeves, the chief accountant said to me, "You know, Mr. Golden, every month the city gets back the canceled checks from the bank. There's a closet filled with these canceled checks that have never been reconciled to the city's books. So nobody has ever undertaken to see whether what the banks say the city has in cash is what the city's own books have in cash." That was just the beginning.
They didn't have an accounting system that made any sense. It was chaotic.
Everybody had stuff in drawers. Everybody had buried stuff. And there's got to be a good end to some of this. There were no fucking books.
Listen, you want to talk to me? I'll talk to you. Don't make a circus out of it.
We're hearing you, sir. We want to ask a question that involves both you and Mr. Golden.
Yeah.
The fact that Mr. Golden had a different estimate of the budget deficit than you did.
Our budget bureau has indicated that their figures are correct, and that's what they're standing by.
Well, I wish I were incorrect, but unfortunately, I think the Bureau of the Budget has been too optimistic.
This disagreement got the attention of the senior bankers, and they started asking questions about additional risk. As a result, the interest rates on the city debt started going up quite sharply.
That Mr. Golden hurt the city?
Well, I just put it my way that I think it had an effect.
Well, I think that's akin to the patient saying that the doctor has caused the illness.
So the dispute between the controller and the mayor now has moved from a disagreement about what the size of the budget gap is to a disagreement about why the city had to pay so much interest on bonds. And in effect, cut.
I was an independently elected controller, so Mayor Beam was not my boss. And there was a big age difference between us. He was much older than I and had a right to think of me as a kid, which he did. On top of that, Mayor Beam had been controller and was in a sense defensive about what he had left behind.
Mr. Beam, a couple of weeks ago, you didn't want to characterize Mr. Golden's motives at that time. You were almost kind toward him.
Nor do I now.
Well, accepting the The war between you two has heated up considerably the last 2 weeks.
I just said to you, and I just made the observation, that I am continuing to do the job that I was elected to as mayor, and the only time I will say anything with respect to my former stewardship in the Comptroller's office will be when I want to correct the record and the facts.
A-Beam's background was Brooklyn clubhouse politics. That meant people would come in and say, I'm having trouble with my rent. I need some turkeys for Thanksgiving. And you took care of all those little things. That's the milieu in which A-Beam lived.
I want to know, though, is it proper for me to discuss certain items that would relate to spending money for community improvement in the area now before you as members of the Board of
You might as well mention it.
Because the city was so big, there was always money coming in and going out. And so you could promise, if it was going to be a good year, that thing that you wanted there in Brooklyn, we can build that.
There's a common cry at this all-day grousing for better schools, better hospital facilities, better roads, better parks, better libraries. And there's a common answer from the mayor and his men up there on the platform. It's basically, sorry, we'd like to help, but we just haven't got the cash.
We really are in trouble. The present operating budget, which was balanced on July 1st, is now $400 million down.
How does that get remedied?
Well, first of all, the way we can remedy it would be with new taxes, which the mayor ruled out. He didn't say forever, but he ruled out at the present time. And the other way would be to cut the operating expenses of the city right now.
Mr. Beam, you said that you get along with the construction workers, yet Tom Tobin said that this used to be a union town. How do you react to that?
Well, you know, you get carried away at times. This is a union town. It's always going to remain one.
Mayor Beam has $29 million allocated for construction that he's holding back. You people are the ones that can find out for us where that $29 million is.
We'll give it our best effort.
We know you will, sweetheart. Thanks for your
The costs for the labor force in New York City were overwhelming. I mean, in the decade before the shit hit the fan, from 63 to 73, the cost of New York City government grew 3.5 times. That is a big pile of dollars. And that would have never happened without the help of Nelson Rockefeller, who was governor of the state of New York forever.
Nelson Rockefeller was an ambitious governor. He spent a lot of money, liked to build things, liked to do things, and it wasn't always paid for as well as one would like.
Adoption of a universal health insurance program, further improvement of public transportation and other community services, major expansion of housing and urban development. Let us continue to maintain New York as a model to the nation of what creative, responsible state government can achieve for the people. I thank you very much indeed. Best of luck.
All throughout the 60s, Nelson Rockefeller was the face of Northeastern liberal republicanism, something that doesn't really exist anymore. Here was a man who was a big Cold Warrior, wanted to increase the military, but was also for public spending on education, civil rights, healthcare, cultural institutions. I mean, almost single-handedly, he built 80,000 units of affordable housing for Rockefeller. This was not extravagance. This was civilization.
New York loved him, absolutely loved him. He could be relied upon to be honest and straight, mainly because he was rich and he didn't have to steal. But he was the godfather of the fiscal nightmare of New York City.
Whenever they got into fiscal difficulty, the city would call on the governor to help approve another type of tricky bond, like tax originating bonds or tax anticipation bonds, all of which was hoopy-doopy to raise money with no real assets behind it.
Tax anticipation notes. There's going to be a tax, trust us. Bond anticipation notes. For this bond, we're going to issue another bond. Finally, moral obligation bonds. Don't worry, the state won't let itself go bankrupt. Trust us.
In late 73, Rockefeller stepped down as governor. One of the people running to replace him was Congressman Hugh Carey. He was a complicated personality. He had been in the Congress 14 years, so he was a real Washington insider. But like Mayor Beam, he was from Brooklyn, New York, so he knew his way around the politics of New York City.
Because Brooklyn gave me a chance, the kind of opportunity that I want for every young man, woman, and child in this great city and in this great state.
Nobody expected him to get the nomination, let alone win a general election. But it was a Watergate year, 1974. People of the state of New York wanted to sweep with a clean broom, and the one they swept in was Hugh Carey.
Hugh Carey. Like all of the smart politicians in New York knew that there had been a long time deferral of fiscal reality in the state, and that the legislature was always moving the target forward for the next guy. So there was an atmosphere of fiscal crisis from the day that Carey was sworn in.
So help me God.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that clip with us, Michael and Peter. As Ken noted, at the Better Angels Society, we were honored in collaboration with the Library of Congress and Ken to award Drop Dead City with the 2023 Library of Congress Lavine Ken Burns Prize for Film. This again recognizes the best American history documentary in progress. So you saw there that the clip we just saw is still a rough cut, and at the end of our program, Michael Rohatyn is going to talk a little bit about what is next for the film. But for now, we're going to talk a little bit about the film itself from this incredible panel. And as I said to them all earlier, I'm going to do them all an incredible disservice with brief introductions because they are all so distinguished, but I really do want to get to this conversation. But I want to briefly introduce the whole panel, and then we'll come back and start some questions. But again, if you'd like to drop questions into the Q&A, I'll try to work some of those in as well. So first, our two filmmakers, director and producer. Michael Rohatyn is a screenwriter and a musician who's worked in features and documentaries, such as the Sundance Grand Jury Prize winner, 40 Shades of Blue, and Maggie's Plan. He scored the Emmy-nominated documentary Arthur Miller, Writer, for HBO. As a boy in 1975, Michael had a front row seat to the mini dramas that are featured in the film, and he knew some of the players personally. Felix Rohatyn, chairman of the MAC, was his father. Also, director and producer Peter Yost, who is a multiple Emmy-nominated filmmaker whose latest film, Nazi Town, USA, was the 2024 season opener for American Experience at WGBH, and the Better Angels Society was honored to support this film through our Better Angels Stories program. Peter's other films include Mysteries of Mental Illness, Solitary Confinement, which led to prison reforms in Colorado and elsewhere, Inside North Korea, and The Color of Oil. He's also produced films for PBS Nova and National Geographic's Specials Unit. Peter C. Goldmark Jr., as we have just seen, was the budget secretary to the state of New York, and since then he served in many distinguished positions, including as CEO of the International Herald Tribune, president of the Rockefeller Foundation, and director of climate initiatives at the Environmental Defense Fund. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the recipient of numerous awards, including the Wilson Wyatt National Award for Urban Revitalization and the French Legion of Honor. Dr. Kenneth T. Jackson is the former president of the New York Historical Society and the Jacques Barzin Professor Emeritus of History at Columbia, where he taught courses in urban, social, and military history, and his scholarship often focused on New York City. Dr. Jackson used the subways and back streets and neighborhoods of the city as his classroom, leading all-night bicycle rides and walking tours for decades. He was honored with the 28th Annual Mark Van Doren Award for Humanity, Devotion to Truth, and Inspiring Leadership. He also served as the president of the Urban History Association, the Society of American Historians, and the New York Academy of History. And last but certainly not least, Rebecca Miller is an independent spirit and Gotham Award-winning and Emmy-nominated filmmaker who's written and directed 7 feature films, among them Angela, Personal Velocity, The Ballad of Jack and Rose, The Private Lives of Pippa Lee, Maggie's Plan, and Arthur Miller, Writer. Several of her films are in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art. So let's start with our panel and start with our pair of filmmakers. Michael and Peter, how and, or I guess why and how did you make the film?
First, I have to say thank you to every person on this panel and to the Better Angels and to the New York Historical Society and to the Lavine family. The thanks keep accumulating in this project. We are getting so much support and we are so humbled and grateful for all of it. So just start right there. That wasn't why we made the movie or how, but it is how we are making the movie. I should why did we make this movie? Peter and I walked, we were parents of kids at the same school and we were walking home one day. And I guess he had a hole in his busy filmmaking schedule and kicking around ideas of like, well, what's a good story? And I had just days before been speaking with my partner about the fact that no one had done this period of time in New York. It's a period of time that I know very well and my family is very connected to. But so I didn't really think that much about it, but I sort of threw it out to Peter, and he was intrigued and enough to say, let's look into that a bit. And together we started to interview a few people to see if we had a story, and we found that we did have a story. We had many stories, and we also had wonderful characters. I was able to get a hold of a lot of my father's colleagues from that period, including Peter Goldmark, who was really a guide to us very, very early on, maybe the first. And we started to chart a course through this story. And as happens with many good stories, you think you know the story, and then you realize you don't. And then in this one, we came to appreciate that there were many stories, and we made a little bit of a concerted sort of a decision to allow those stories to coexist and to not use a narrator, to use only archive, all of which are, directorial choices, and made things harder, but I think made the film much more rewarding to make and also, I hope, to watch. Peter, does that line up with your memory, or maybe you have another version?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you all for watching this and for your interest in the project. Yeah, Michael, that does square with my sense of things. And I would just add, I actually grew up in Buffalo, not in New York, like Michael obviously did. And I remember telling stories of my childhood and then Michael countering with some of his, which involved, the governor landing on the lawn or, meetings at 3 a.m. because the city's about to go over a cliff. And even I was stopped dead in my tracks and said, wait, there might be a story here. And so I think we agreed on that right from the beginning, that there was a amazing drama with incredible stakes. And as Michael says, tremendous characters. And then what also just sold me, I've been doing this for arguably too long, for decades, and have been around a lot of films, historical and otherwise. And we spoke to people and they were incredibly compelling intellectually. And we could talk about this. I'm sure the other folks are more qualified to do so. But personally, I feel like there's incredible meaning to much of the film and resonance today with where we are, and decisions and questions about what does the government owe its society, or what does society, what is the relationship? I mean, some big picture questions. So it was intellectually and socially important. And then what really personally sold me, and not that I needed that much more selling, was the archive is just unparalleled in my, multi-decade, as I have a gray beard, career. We just started pulling things off shelves, literally. And this is back, obviously shot in 74, 75. The entire film, we decided to tell just in a ticking clock way across the year of the ups and downs. And we pretty literally just pulled the daily archive that had been shot by all kinds of news organizations. And there was a blessing being in New York because there are lots of cameras. And all of this stuff was shot on film, not on video, not on kind of 80s kind of blurry stuff. It's just gorgeous. And unfortunately, I actually winced a little bit watching this. Maybe we'll talk about this later in the film, but as Catherine, as you mentioned, it's low resolution, kind of uncolor corrected, crappy looking stuff right now. But underneath that, it's a little bit like shaving after a long camping trip or something. Like, it'll be removed and be utterly gorgeous. And so when we started to look at the archive, at least for me too, that's the other thing to add to this, Michael, was just every detail, every character, and it felt like we were excavating. I mean, almost, not to be pretentious, but like an archaeologist might. We're coming up on the 50th anniversary of this fiscal crisis in the coming year. And the vast majority, plus or minus 90, 95% of this stuff has not been seen since. And so it's really exciting almost to bear witness to some of the kind of lost, if you will, individuals, small and large, famous and unknown, who we came across, and almost just screen them and then do the honor of trying to put this together in hopefully a coherent way has just been a thrill, frankly.
Absolutely. Well, it's so beautiful and evocative as a rough cut. I can't imagine what it's going to look like as a finished film, but it's going to be fantastic. I do want to come back to the archival piece and some of the craft of filmmaking that Rebecca is going to help us think through in a second. But I want to turn to Dr. Jackson to go a little deeper on the historical context. Dr. Jackson, why is this moment in New York such an important one?
Well, New York is, of course, 400 years old, more than any other city, and a lot has happened. And there could be many things. It could be turning points, the draft riots, the Civil War, the Great Depression, World War II, the World Trade Center. But as I think of New York, and I'm writing about the city since World War II, 1975 stands out because here's the greatest city in the world, the most powerful country in the world, the capital of capitalism, and it can't pay its bills. And so it is a dramatic story and a very negative story. And of course, technically the city didn't go bankrupt, but I think that the larger context, there's a lot of blame to go around, to Abe Beame, to John Lindsay, who was smart and young, well-intentioned, creative, created all these little city halls around that seemed to be successful, hired wonderfully talented people. But nevertheless, they get a lot of the blame. Abe Beame, who was the controller, John Lindsay, who was creative about spending money, but not so good at keeping track of it, of being a good CEO. But I think there are larger issues here. First of all, in the whole scheme of things, New York soared after World War II, had no competition from Berlin and Tokyo, and really even London and Paris, because they were destroyed, or destroyed physically, if not fiscally, if not physically. But New York's really decline really begins in the 1950s. It was the leading industrial city in the world as late as 1954. Industry began moving away. Corporate headquarters began to move, first to Westchester in Connecticut, then to Atlanta and Texas and other places. That was big. Think of General Foods and IBM and others. the corporate exodus from the city, as I say, was big. The biggest story, however, was white flight. And when you think of the 60s and 70s, and middle-class white families, the vision of typical families was a suburb with a house surrounded by grass and a car outside. I'm not saying everybody accepted that, but certainly that was the American dream. And millions of New Yorkers began to follow it, moving out of the Bronx toward Westchester in Connecticut, out of Brooklyn and Queens toward Long Island, out of Brooklyn also toward New Jersey. So those suburbs just blossomed in the 60s and 70s, taking their taxpayers with them. Meanwhile, not quite as dramatic was the influx of poor Black persons coming from the old rural South and Puerto Ricans who are already citizens, but nevertheless were relatively impoverished compared to the people who had moved to the suburbs. So they come to the city having relatively greater needs from the city for social services and things like this. And therefore, that's part of the back. That's what the trap that A. Beam and John Lindsay led us into. They should have been watching a little more closely, but nevertheless, it's not their entire fault. But I think what's remarkable about the great crisis of 1975, and of course, it's not a one moment there. It's 1970s, mid-70s, even bigger than that, is that the city recovered from it. Because when you think of New York City's long narrative of history, and 1975 is a big date, the city comes back. Unlike every other city in the Northeast and Midwest, even Boston, Philadelphia, Washington decline in population. Newark, Buffalo, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Detroit, St. Louis, all go into really absolute decline, not just relative decline. New York City, what's different about New York City in 2020 than it was in 1950? Has more people. So yes, people moved to the suburbs, but somebody else took their place. In that period after 1975, when so many people thought the city was doomed, and it looked like it might be with other cities, it continued to prosper, or began to prosper again. New skyscrapers, new immigrants. The big thing was the new Immigration Act, so that suddenly New York begins to become the promised city once more. And those immigrants, contrary to popular belief now, work hard, don't cost the society very much. They just wanted a chance, and they got the chance, and the city provided it. And so, and the city got reasonably good leadership. I mean, just think, New York City has not had a mayor who went to prison. Actually, not even then when Jimmy Walker was mayor. But really, you could knock different mayors of New York City, but there's so much of a floodlight on them that the city has had relatively good mayors who had a vision. Some of them could pull it off better than others. I think Ed Koch gets some of their credit for taking the city when it was on its back. And when after he'd been mayor for 12 years, the city was clearly coming back. And Michael Bloomberg, who took it after the World Trade Center, when people wondered whether anyone would ever want to live in a dense city or a tall building or go into a dark subway again. Well, of course they did. And the city set records after that time. So I think the real story is those people, as well as the people like Dick Ravitch, who showed up on the thing. Two people who don't, Victor Gottbaum, the labor union leader, Lou Rudin, who led the real estate community really to prepay their taxes, the teachers union, so that while the city is on its back and it's actually bankrupt, it doesn't technically go bankrupt. And I think that's an important distinction. So I think we have a lot of people to thank.
Dr. Jackson, thank you. I really appreciate that idea about public leadership and how important it is. And I think this film captures that in a really powerful way. And I want to turn to Peter Goldmark to talk a little bit more about that. And Peter, this was really one of your first experiences in public life in a long and distinguished career. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of what did you learn from this experience and what does it have to teach us to today?
Thank you, Catherine. First of all, I don't want to disappoint you. I'd been in public service for 10 years before I wind up as budget director, handled crises, so on. But this was a unique experience. And you're right in that. The first thing that was unique and startling about it is nobody knew where the money was going, by what time, and for what reason. Nobody had put that together. Staggering. Second of all, it is the interrelated story with New York City at the center and the visible piece, but there are two other pieces of the New York financial structure which were intimately involved and whom we also had to save from default: the state budget and the public authorities. Why? Because the debt held all over the country by banks, they simply called New York labeled debt. And they didn't know whether they had the state or the city or the state's public housing. It was New York labeled debt. And we had to prevent all of it from going back. That was complicated. Now, as you know from watching the movie, Catherine, one of the remarkable things about this is a group of people coming together in response to a problem they didn't understand when they were forced to join it. And many of them winding up deciding they would do something they had sworn they would never do. There were people from Gerald Ford, the president, to Albert Shanker. And remember the session, the Lonely Weekend with Ravitch, that is recounted in the movies. And there were others who said, I will never fill in the blank. And almost everybody, as the dimensions and the consequences of what was at stake became clear, and as its complications got understood, and gradually a joint tapestry of what it was all about was assembled, many of them reached the conclusion that they would have to do what they would sworn they would, of course, never do. So it was a very unique period. It was quite well reported by the press, even though there were dimensions the press simply didn't know because almost nobody knew them. And there were a lot of people in public life, civil servants in some cases, uniformed officers and others, legislators, who did things and stretched in ways they had never stretched before. And that is an interesting sign of the resilience in the American democratic systems. And I hope that statement raises in all of you listening tonight a few questions about where we are today.
Before we turn to Rebecca to talk about the film itself, I do have one more question, Peter. I mean, were you frightened?
Frightened is the wrong word. I was afraid that there were too many forces under control, and I mean, we could have defaulted by accident. There was one night, Catherine, when the legislature was in town, the governor was away, I don't know where he was, and they had to pass 10 technical bills, all designed to prevent default by the state's public authority. They only passed 9. And they went home, and a reporter came down, and it was midnight or something, to ask me, what are you going to do, Mr. Goldmark? They didn't pass the 10th bill. And I gulped. My assistant told me later, and I counted 5 Mississippi, 1, 2, 3. I ordered the Capitol Police to lock the Capitol so nobody more could leave. I called the speaker, said it was coming up. We had to pass the other bill. I called the state police. I had no legal authority to do any of this. I said, I want a state trooper car at every exit on the thruway, and any legislators who come home, I want you to turn them back. And then I got everybody who was still working in the Capitol, said, I want you guys to go out to every bar in Albany and bring back all the legislators you can find. I had no authority to do this. This is one of those moments when you discover possibilities you've got in you didn't know you had it. New York Times called it Goldmark's midnight roundup. I'm sorry. And at 5 a.m., there are 150 seats in the assembly. And 5 a.m., there were 76 human beings. And they raised their hand and passed a bill they didn't understand, that nobody had understood the consequences of. Now, I cannot look you in the eye and tell you all those 76 were members of the state assembly. We got it done.
Peter, that is an amazing story, and that is leadership. I also really appreciate that you took a deep breath before you took those actions that were not at all within your authority. I think a small tactical lesson for anyone in a challenging moment. Thank you for sharing that story. I saw Rebecca reacting to it the same way I was. What a fantastic story. But Rebecca, let's turn to you and talk a little bit about the sort of craft of filmmaking. I mean, what are the challenges of telling a story like this? And how did these filmmakers, in your opinion, make a film that was so compelling and so evocative?
Well, I've been privileged to watch the film over a period of years become itself. So I've watched various cuts. And I will tell you that as much as it was so intriguing and compelling, the 10 minutes that we saw, it doesn't hold a candle to the actual film. The film is amazing. I mean, it is really, when I first saw what they were trying to do, I thought they will never do this. I don't know how you do this, because it is it's a complex story, but it's also a story that could be not that interesting about, I thought money and numbers, and yet what it is the most human kind of edge of your seat, almost like a thriller. Like you're right there, like moment to moment, seeing, is this city going to implode? It's a very, a radical, bold choice that they made to have no narration and just go with this extremely deep archival. I mean, this archival, I can't think of a film really that's better, has better use of archival. And even David Tedeschi, who's Martin Scorsese's editor of Docs, said that it was the best use of archival in a New York film that he'd ever seen. I mean, it is really an extraordinary piece of art. It's also, what's really interesting, and I only was thinking about it just now, is like, in a sense, this New York is a kind of dream, like, and it's a dream that's constantly being dreamed, and it needs to keep happening. And in a way, the fact that they just locked up all their canceled checks and never resolved them and never sort of dealt with it, it's sort of classic. It's just, it all got put in the unconscious because we wanted to keep dreaming New York. We wanted to keep like fabricating this fabulous place that then one day somebody said, wait a second, this doesn't exist, but that's what New York is. It's a dream, and like, that's also what's so beautiful about, the tenderness also that they have about the wonderful experiment that this period was of enormous generosity. You could say just plain humanity, of free education, like for college students, which is something that even now is being is a big debate and seems pretty reasonable to a lot of people. But we were doing it in New York in the 70s, and many other things that seem actually like a really good idea that they were attempting. But it is an edge of your seat kind of film. It also has amazing use of music, and just beautiful pacing. Also, I have to say that the way that you guys compose the many of the interviews is so unusual and beautiful, and it's very important. It's very artfully done. So it just feels like such a wonderful, rewarding, dense, interesting piece of art that's also a really important historical document. And I think it's something that we need to look back and remember, and maybe maybe it will help fuel our dreaming as New Yorkers. It'll help fuel our dreams of the future. Yeah, I mean, it's both a lost world, but it's also the world that in many ways we're trying to rekindle or find again. I mean, that it's so very modern in that way. Anyway, I really do feel strongly about the film, and I love it very much. Wow. And it's amazing, just from a point of view of as a filmmaker. I can't even believe that they did it. I really can't.
I love the New York Times did a feature when the film won the prize, and I loved what Ken Burns said in that article, which was somehow they made the accounting sexy.
Exactly.
I thought that was fantastic compliment from, particularly from Ken. But I do, Rebecca, you talked about the archival research, and so I want to come back to you, Peter, and just have you talk a little more deeply about, I mean, it sounds like there was some drama to that. You were just pulling things off the shelves and you know, seeing these sources just sort of come to life and connect to each other, and then you captured them. So, you know, I know that for both Ken and Dr. Hayden in awarding the prize, they both talked about how important the depth of your archival research was, and then how, in the ways you just described, Rebecca, these sources were just activated. So could you talk a little bit more about that process of archival research?
Absolutely. And thank you, all of you, again, for these kind words. And the support. It's humbling to hear it. The archival research has just been years of, and we've been working with amazing colleagues who are expert at that, more expert certainly than Michael and I personally are, but it's been really a process of discovery in a very deep and at times moving way. I kind of alluded to that earlier. But a lot of this stuff, look, if the checks weren't in sequence and weren't tracked, neither was the archive in many instances from that time. So
Right.
some of the time we could go fishing for, like, there's something that happened on this date that we know is compelling and we really need to see X, Y, or Z, and pull what you have, and they had nothing. And other times we just kind of literally would kind of get our hands on boxes and take a look. And sometimes we'd go down there on these old film machines and play it, which was really fun. But even in the steps that we had to do to do this, pretty much hardly any of this stuff had been transferred off of film, which is sort of just an inefficient way of going about this. We're all used to Google searching or go to YouTube and check this out. And you could get a hint of things. You can Google certainly now and find New York 75 street scenes and find some very beautiful things. But when we got into it, what we had to do was get our hands on the actual reels of film. And what was fun is they would send news crews out to shoot whatever they were shooting. It could be something as banal as a toll booth hike, you know, a fare going from whatever it was, 5 cents to 20 cents or 10 cents. And they would shoot a little bit of somebody driving by in a car. And then we realized, though, that they weren't going to cut the film. They were going to just shoot the rest of the roll. And so we ended up with something in that instance, for example, that's just an incredible anthropological excursion where we got 10 minutes. You couldn't pay Hollywood directors to outfit the hair as well, or music designers, because the Trans Am would pull up with somebody with an incredible 1975 outfit with the music of the moment, and they'd put their thing in and be like, hey man, thanks, and drive off. And then you just wait 5 seconds and the next car would pull off. And the minute that we kind of realized, wait a minute, we could sit here and watch 10 minutes straight of toll booth. There's something here, because if that's interesting, then the dramatic scenes, if we can just hang in there long enough to find them and get our hands on them. So again, the archive, it was very laborious, expensive, ultimately. And Michael, to his credit, I think all of our creative team, we kind of doubled down on this and just said, if we're going to do it, do it. No narration. It's about an hour and a half, 40 minutes of straight archive, which most people are not dumb enough to do because it's labor intensive and expensive. But I think it hopefully is what makes the difference ultimately. And it allows people to really immerse themselves fully in that moment with no narrator and no period inappropriate material getting in the way.
It is immersive. That is a great way to describe it. You know, one of the other things, I'll direct this one to you, Michael. One of the other things that Ken has said was that normally when you have someone making a film about a close family member, it's a red flag. But, you know, in awarding the prize, he also noted how beautifully you handled that. And it turned out not to be a red flag at all. So would you talk to us a little bit about what it was like to make a film about your father, but how you did it in a way that again has generated praise for the elegance and the restraint with which you did it?
That's very kind of you. Well, you know, my father was an intellectual. I mean, he was a banker, but he was also really driven by ideas and loved ideas and putting ideas together. And I kind of feel like that was governing the way that we were feeling about the story. He's one of the figures in it. Of course, I felt sentimental, still do whenever I see him on camera, but his role in the story was of a kind of a thoughtful person and not a grandstander. And so it wasn't that hard really for me to sort of see him where, where he, I think, was. And it helped to have Peter and Don, who's our editor, who's watching, very small team, that's it, to make sure that that's what we were doing. And I think sometimes we went too far, and we had to, there's a little, that was harder for me to judge than other stuff. But I appreciate you bringing that up. But yeah, it certainly makes it very, very gratifying to have this conversation. He would be beyond proud and just glad that people are talking about these things, these topics, the things that Peter Goldmark and Ken Jackson have been talking about. He would love to meet Peter Yost, and he loved Rebecca Miller. So there you go. I think he's well represented.
Peter and Ken, we'll go to both of you as we wrap up. Let's start with you, Peter.
I just wanted to add a word about Felix. Felix was absolutely critical here, but not as a financial analyst. That wasn't his role. He was a thinker. He was able to capture how things were. I remember an early press conference, a reporter asked a question of the governor. We were all there, and he asked the governor, and he said, "Governor, everybody's talking about default as if it's terrible. What's so bad about default?" And Governor Carey froze. And Felix stepped to the microphone, and Felix said, "Default is like slitting your wrist in a warm bathtub. It doesn't hurt, but you die anyway." I just give you that. Now, here was somebody in the middle of this exercise who could do that over and over, dealing with politicians, bankers, union. So he was a thinker and an idea person. That was his role. He was not a financial analyst, not in this exercise.
Peter, thank you so much for sharing that. Dr. Jackson?
Well, I wanted to endorse what Peter just said, that Felix Rohatyn did have a major role in this, I think, as everyone understands, because what had been lost in some ways in 1975 was trust. That the bankers and the investors had sort of trusted that the people who were running New York City knew what they were doing and were honest about it. And so there was a doubt about that in their minds. And the Emergency Financial Control Board and other things, Al Shanker, the teachers union, had an important role to play. So in a way, it's a way in which Rebecca Miller said the love of the city. A lot of these people realized they had a stake in this. If the city goes under, if it loses its reputation for honesty, for honoring its bills, then everybody loses a lot. So at the end of the day, they realized we've got a stake in this, and we're going to throw in our hats to make it work.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. I think that's a perfect place to sort of wrap up the panel, because I do think it's a film that is about the love of the city too. And it really is in some ways sort of a love letter to the city, even at a incredibly challenging moment. So thank you all, Peter and Ken, Rebecca, other Peter, Peter the filmmaker. Thank you all so much. I want to turn now to Michael, though, to talk a little bit about what is next for the film. And as we do, I want to welcome Sahil Reza-Yazdi, who is from the Gotham Institute of Film and Media, who can also talk about how you can support this film. But first, Michael, tell us where we are in this.
Well, so it is, of course, appropriate for a story such as ours to come down to financing. We have been working at this a very long time, and everybody's talking about the archive, which is immensely gratifying. It's also immensely costly. Our number now is $470,000 in order to get it to film festivals. We're not allowed to show what you just saw anywhere except in the context of something like this or at home. We desperately want to bring this film out to an audience. just this conversation alone has been exhilarating, to be able to start talking and listening to people talking about the ideas that we hope we're going to be advancing and reintroducing. So the 470, many years ago when Peter and I started, we were both handsomer and perhaps funnier. That number was quite a lot lower, but that is the stark reality. And we've already raised 660, and we have spent it. That has gotten us here. It has come from the immense support of the Lavine Ken Burns Prize. And now the further support of the Better Angels is just, I can't even, I have no words. So that is where we are. And I'll pass it now to Sohail, who is representing our fiscal sponsor. I'll let him explain what it is, but I think in broadest strokes, it is what grants us, why we love him, the tax exemption status that we have, which allows donors to take a tax deduction. And I think this might be the last time I get to say this, but bless you all. Thank you, Dr. Jackson, Peter Goldmark, Peter Yost, Catherine, everybody, for being here. Rebecca, everybody.
Thank you, Michael. Sohail.
Thank you, everybody out there in the ether world.
And thank you, Michael. Hi, everyone. My name is Sohail Reza Yazdi. I'm the manager of nonfiction programs at the Gotham Film and Media Institute. So the Gotham is a nonprofit organization devoted to supporting independent filmmakers and their work. You may know us by our previous name, IFP, which we had for many decades, and by the magazine that we publish quarterly, Filmmaker Magazine. We are a New York-based organization ourselves. We've been around since 1979. So in my role at the Gotham, I oversee our documentary programming as well as our fiscal sponsorship program. In addition to fiscal sponsorship, we have mentorship programs, fellowship programs, and an annual project market where documentaries that are in production can meet with industry representatives. But today I just want to talk to you all quickly about fiscal sponsorship. So when we fiscally sponsor a project like Drop Dead City, we in essence provide two major benefits to the film. So first, the project is able to give donors the incentive of a charitable deduction for income tax purposes, which is something they couldn't otherwise do if they were simply raising money on Kickstarter, for example. So in essence, folks can donate to Drop Dead City through us and receive a tax incentive for doing so. The second incentive they receive is that filmmakers can seek grants and other funding sources that are ordinarily restricted to tax-exempt organizations. So the film itself isn't tax-exempt, but because the Gotham is, and we are fiscally sponsoring the project, they can receive the benefits of a tax-exempt organization. So the money comes to us first and is earmarked for specific projects. We then pass the funding along to the project and collect receipts from them to make sure that the money they're raising is in fact being used to make the film. This is a core IRS requirement that makes fiscal sponsorship possible. So we do this for, I would say, roughly 100 projects annually all across the US. And to date, we have raised along the lines of $32 million in donations for hundreds of projects since we began doing fiscal sponsorship. And we have been the fiscal sponsor for Drop Dead City in particular since 2017. So as far as making the actual donation, there are three major ways that you can do that. One is by credit card. So each project we sponsor has its own designated page on our fiscal sponsorship website. So you can head to that page and click Make a Contribution to donate by card. It's very quick and very easy. You can also donate by check or by wire transfer. You'll find the instructions on how to do that on Drop Dead City's page on our website as well. And I believe the Better Angel Society will send in a follow-up email after this event with the link to that page and instructions to donate for all three ways: credit card, wire transfer, or check. One thing we would just note is that if you're going to make a larger donation, which I hope folks would consider doing, is to go with check or wire transfer, as a credit card fee can eat into a larger donation quite substantially. So shortly after we receive your donation, you will receive a receipt from us that you can give to your accountant, and that can be used when you file your taxes, like you would a donation to any other charity or nonprofit. So I think that's everything on my end. Thank you all, and I'm going to pass it back to Catherine.
All right, Sahil, thank you so much. And Michael, thank you. And thank you to our tremendous panel tonight and to our partners at the New York Historical Society. As Sahil said, we will be sending out, you'll receive an email tomorrow. It'll have a link to the Gotham website and Drop Dead City's page there. So you can support this incredible film. You can also learn more about the Better Angels Society and have an opportunity to sign up for our email list so you can attend more programs like this. We do them about quarterly, and they are always just this much fun. There will also be a link to the recording of this program, so you can see that as well. So again, I just want to say thank you to everyone who was here. Thank you in absentia to Ken Burns for being here to introduce the clip. Thank you to this wonderful panel and to all of you who love American history documentaries and understand how important they are to our country. Thank you all and have a good night.